My Syntergic theory led me to a conclusion that many would rather not hear. Everyday reality could be a perfectly organized hallucination. Not because the world doesn't exist, but because we never perceive it directly. The brain takes a fraction of the lattice, transforms it into images, sounds, and meanings, and then presents it as the only possible truth. Maybe the difference between being sane and being insane isn't who sees the truth, but how many people share the same construct.
People who claim that magic doesn't exist might be right. Or maybe they just don't have the frequency needed to perceive it. Because what we call reality isn't everything that exists. It's just the small fraction that our senses and our brain are able to turn into experience. Jacobo Grinberg dedicated his life to investigating that frontier. And his proposal leads to a conclusion that can divide anyone. Two people can be in the same place and not inhabit the same reality. One will see coincidences. The other will see signs. One will encounter obstacles. The other will discover doors. One will think that all of this is absurd. The other will start to notice coincidences that she can no longer explain so easily. Maybe the magic was never hidden. Maybe the real problem is that you've spent your whole life tuning into the wrong channel. The easiest answer is to say that your luck changed. But Jacobo Grinberg spent much of his life exploring a much more interesting possibility. Maybe the reality you experience isn't a finished movie that your brain just watches. Maybe it's a construction that appears every second at the meeting point between what exists and the consciousness that perceives it. That means you never come to an experience as a blank slate. You arrive with memories, expectations, emotions, wounds, habits of attention, and a story about who you are. All of that forms a kind of internal frequency, and that frequency decides which details pass through the filter, what meaning they receive, and what response seems possible. It might sound magical. In a way, it is. Not because you can close your eyes, imagine a Ferrari, and expect it to appear parked in your kitchen. That would be magic, but also a serious architectural problem. The magical thing is discovering that two people can inhabit the same place, go through the same event, and still live completely different realities. However, before continuing, look away from the screen for 3 seconds. Look around you and find something that was in front of you, but that you hadn't noticed until this moment. That object already existed. However, it wasn't part of your conscious reality until your attention selected it. You just experienced, on a small scale, the question that haunted Jacobo Grinberg throughout his entire life. How many things exist in front of us that our consciousness still cannot perceive? If today you decide to stop living your life on autopilot, write in the comments, "I choose to see what was once invisible." Don't write it for the algorithm. Write it as a decision. Grinberg tried to explain that mystery through the Syntergic theory. According to his model, the brain produces a neuronal field of enormous complexity. That field interacts with a fundamental structure of space, which he called the lattice. And from that interaction, conscious experience emerges. The lattice is something like a network that has immense information capacity. The brain would not receive a fully formed reality. It would organize it, reduce it, and turn it into colors, sounds, shapes, distances, and meanings. You don't need to accept this theory as an absolute truth to understand the power of its question. If experience depends on the organization of the observer, what happens when the observer changes? This is where frequency stops being just a pretty word and starts becoming a tool. Imagine an old radio. All the stations can be broadcasting at the same time, but you only hear the one that the dial manages to tune into. Moving it a few millimeters can turn noise into music. The radio didn't create the song, but its tuning decided which part of the field became audible. Your consciousness acts similarly. It doesn't perceive everything. It selects, organizes, amplifies some signals, and silences others. Your brain is not an impartial camera. It's more like a rushed editor who cuts scenes. It adds dramatic music and then assures you that the documentary is completely objective. When you're in love, any song seems like it was written for you. When you've just had an argument, the same song feels like a provocation from the universe. When you're afraid, a neutral look turns into suspicion. When you're calm, that look doesn't even take up space in your memory. The outside world may have changed very little. What changed was the level at which you were interpreting it. The spiritual tradition called this vibration, resonance, or state of consciousness. Grinberg tried to approach it from perception, brain activity, and the relationship between the observer and the observed. Different languages pointing toward a similar intuition. Experience doesn't depend only on what happens, but also on the structure that receives it. The problem arose when the idea of frequency became a promise of immediate delivery. Think positively, vibrate at a high frequency, and the universe will send your order. But the universe is not Amazon Prime. Sometimes the answer arrives late, without instructions, and in a box that doesn't seem to contain what you asked for. Thinking about frequency in a deeper way doesn't mean denying the facts. It means observing the state from which you interpret them and the reality you begin to build from that interpretation. That process has 3 layers. The first is the internal state: fear, openness, resentment, trust, anxiety, or clarity. The second is the automatic meaning you assign. This is dangerous. I'm not enough. They're rejecting me. There's an opportunity here. The third is the action that comes from the previous 2. Running away, attacking, asking, waiting, insisting, or giving up. State, meaning, and action form a circuit. The circuit produces a result. Afterwards, the result seems to confirm the state with which everything began. A person is afraid of being rejected, enters a conversation defensively, and responds coldly before the other person can hurt them. The other person senses distance and also shuts down. In the end, the person thinks, I knew it. Nobody wants to get close. His brain has just scripted the crime, investigated the case, and congratulated itself for finding the culprit. Reality confirmed the belief, but the belief played a part in producing that reality. This explains why someone can change cities, partners, jobs, and even their haircut, but still keep finding the same conflict. The setting is new. The pattern that organizes the experience traveled in the suitcase. Watch how 2 people react to losing the same client. The first one feels that his business is doomed, makes fewer calls, avoids proposals, and reads every silence as another sign of failure. The second one feels the blow, but also realizes that he was relying too much on a single source of income. He reviews his strategy, looks for another niche, and starts conversations he used to postpone. The loss was real for both of them. Neither of them manifested it through their thoughts, but the frequency from which they processed it opened up completely different fields of possibilities. Months later, one of them claims she had bad luck. The other says that crisis forced her to evolve. Maybe both of them are partly right. Luck intervenes. Circumstances matter, and not everything is under control. But between the event and the outcome, there were hundreds of small decisions governed by what each one could perceive. This is where one of Grinberg's most valuable ideas comes in. To perceive means to organize complexity. His theory described the brain's neuro-algorithmic capacity to process and organize information. Put simply, without turning this into a class that forces us to pretend we're taking notes, you can't experience something that your structure doesn't yet know how to organize. That's why some limits don't look like walls. They look like empty spaces. The opportunity is right in front of you, but you don't recognize it. Someone is trying to help you, but your distrust interprets their gesture as manipulation. A solution appears, but it contradicts your identity so much that you dismiss it before even considering it. You don't see a closed door. You simply don't see the door. When you maintain a state of threat for a long time, your attention becomes skilled at detecting dangers. It notices the slightest change in a voice, the delay of a message, the ambiguous expression on a face. That skill might have protected you at another time, but now it directs the stage lighting. Everything threatening is under a spotlight, and everything else remains in the shadows. That's how a bad day begins before anything bad actually happens. The body wakes up tense. The mind opens its eyes, and before you even get up, it has already scheduled a meeting with all your problems. The first difficulty seems enormous. Traffic turns into a personal attack. A brief email sounds hostile. In the end, you say, "I knew today would be terrible." Maybe it wasn't a prophecy. Maybe it was an active frequency selecting data, assigning meaning to that data and triggering responses that increased friction. The good news is that a learned frequency can be reorganized. The bad news is that buying a new notebook is usually not enough. We all know that scene. A person decides to transform their life. They buy a fancy planner. They write down goals. They sign up at the gym. And they prepare a routine that would require 37-hour days. For a week, they feel unstoppable. 3 weeks later, the notebook is empty, and now the guilt has a leather cover. The problem wasn't always a lack of discipline. The new actions were placed on top of an old structure. Underneath the motivation, the fear of failure was still active, along with the need to prove worth and the belief that a setback means you're incapable. When the initial excitement wore off, the system returned to its familiar course. That's why the question isn't just, what do I want to change? The decisive question is, from what state am I trying to change it? You can start a project from terror at being insignificant, or from the desire to create something valuable. On the outside, both people are working. On the inside, one needs every result to confirm their worth. The other can learn, correct, and move on. Fear produces intense bursts. Coherence produces continuity. Here, meditation holds a special place. Grinberg didn't understand it only as relaxation, but as a way to explore the structure of coherence. Meditation allows you to observe how a thought appears, how it captures your attention, and how it becomes a momentary reality. You sit for 5 minutes to find peace, and your mind takes the opportunity to remind you of an embarrassing message you sent in 2014. It seems like a defeat, but that's where the learning begins. You just discovered that you don't decide which thought appears, but you can learn not to follow it until it builds a whole soap opera. When you observe, this is going to go wrong, as a thought, a little distance opens up. When you mistake it for a revelation, the body obeys as if the future were already written. That small distance is the place where a frequency can change. There's no need to levitate or see the lattice shining over the couch. It's enough to recognize the exact moment when an interpretation tries to take over the whole experience. There are 4 movements that allow you to train that ability. The first is to direct your attention. What you observe repeatedly gains weight. If you look for evidence of rejection, you'll find it. If you look for signs that no one is trustworthy, your memory will eagerly cooperate. But you can also train your attention to detect resources, nuances, and possibilities without denying the danger. Try this at the end of the day. Remember a moment that worked, one that made you tense, and a possibility you almost overlooked. It's not about being thankful even for the electricity bill. It's about preventing your brain from only storing things that confirm its old story. The second step is to name the state. Before an important conversation, ask yourself, what frequency am I coming in on? Don't try to correct it right away. Name it. Fear, hurry, need for approval, curiosity, calm. Naming the state prevents it from disguising itself as absolute truth. It's not the same to think this person wants to humiliate me as it is to recognize that I'm entering this conversation expecting to be humiliated. The first phrase condemns. The second one reveals the filter. The third move is to separate facts from the story. Ask two questions. What really happened? And what am I adding? Fact. He didn't respond for 6 hours. Story. He didn't care anymore. He met someone, changed his identity, and probably lives on another continent. The mind hates empty spaces and fills them with admirable efficiency, although it rarely consults the testing department. Separating fact and story doesn't eliminate intuition. It makes it more precise. It allows you to look for information before reacting to a movie that might only be playing inside you. The fourth step is to choose a coherent and small action. Don't ask what your perfect version would do. That imaginary person sleeps 8 hours. He never gets distracted and probably doesn't even exist. Ask what the clearest action available is from a slightly broader state. Wait 10 minutes before responding. Ask for an explanation, send a proposal, finish a task, or say no. A new frequency becomes stable through repeated small decisions. It doesn't need to be spectacular. It needs roots. You can sum up the process in 4 steps. Stop, name, separate, and choose. Pause for a few seconds before acting on the impulse. Name the state that organizes your perception. Separate the fact from the story. Choose a response that doesn't automatically feed the old pattern. Use it before sending an angry message, accepting an offer out of desperation, quitting something out of shame, or starting an argument because someone replied okay without an emoji. World peace may not depend on that emoji, even if sometimes it doesn't seem that way. When you practice this for weeks, something subtle happens. The same people seem to behave differently. Conversations take new directions. Coincidences start showing up. A call comes at just the right moment. You find information you needed. Someone mentions an opportunity that you wouldn't even have heard of before. You can call it selective attention. You can call it synchronicity. You can call it frequency. You can even call it magic if that word helps you feel the mystery. The important thing is to understand that magic is not just about the world moving. It also means that now you can perceive movements that were previously invisible. When your internal state aligns with what you are trying to build, self-sabotage decreases. You stop pulling back just before making progress. You don't interpret every positive sign as a threat. You don't give up just because the process takes longer than expected. Intention and behavior stop moving in opposite directions. That's why the distance between desire and result seems to shrink. Not necessarily because some external force decided to reward you, but because you stopped undoing with one hand what you were trying to build with the other. And maybe both explanations don't have to be at odds. Maybe frequency is, at the same time, a psychological mechanism and a symbolic way to describe a deeper relationship between consciousness and reality. Grinberg operated right on that uncomfortable boundary. He studied the brain with instruments, but he also explored meditation, shamanism, and phenomena that challenged conventional categories. His research on interhemispheric correlation patterns during communication tried to examine whether the interaction between people could be reflected in their brain activity. His interpretations are still debated and do not prove that the mind controls any event at will. But they keep a fascinating question open. How far does the separation between two observers really go? There's no need to turn every coincidence into a cosmic sign or to seek spiritual advice from your receipt number. The mystery becomes more powerful when it doesn't need to be exaggerated. Grinberg's great practical contribution from this perspective is understanding that consciousness not only witnesses experience, but also participates in its organization. Think of two versions of the same person. The first one wakes up needing to prove his worth. Each result works as a verdict. A criticism threatens his identity. A delay equals failure. She works hard, but she spends much of her energy anticipating dangers and defending an image of herself. The second one has the same talents, the same background, and similar problems. However, notice the state she arrives in. She can receive criticism without turning it into condemnation. She can wait without imagining a catastrophe. She can acknowledge fear and still choose clearly. From the outside, the difference might look like luck. From the inside, it's a different way of organizing reality. This doesn't mean living happily all the time. A high frequency doesn't mean smiling while everything is burning. Sometimes, the most coherent response is to feel sadness. Other times, it's setting a boundary, stepping back, or admitting that something hurts. Coherence doesn't eliminate difficult emotions. It prevents a fleeting emotion from taking permanent control of your perception. Ordinary moments are the real training. Frequency is not built only during deep meditation. It is built in line, in traffic, while waiting for an answer, and when a plan changes. That's where you train the state from which you'll act when a real opportunity or a real crisis comes. You won't act based on what you promised you'd feel. You'll act from what you practiced feeling. There will be setbacks. The old pattern will come back disguised as intuition, realism, or that's just how I am. That doesn't mean you've lost your progress. It means the system found the familiar path. Transformation occurs when you notice the return without making it dramatic. You adjust your direction and continue, like someone who realizes they took the wrong exit. You don't need to set the car on fire, write an autobiography about failure, and move to the woods. You just need to get back on the road. Thinking in terms of frequencies, from Grinberg's perspective, means recognizing that lived reality is born from the encounter between an immense field of possibilities and a consciousness capable of organizing only a part of it. You don't control everything that happens, but you can transform the structure through which you encounter it. That structure changes what you notice. What you notice changes the meaning. The meaning guides your decisions. Decisions sustained over time change trajectories, and trajectories end up becoming destinies. At first, we wondered why some days everything flows and others seem to close off. Now the question is different. Who is stepping into that day? The observer who can only recognize threats? The one who repeats old meanings? Or an awareness that's present enough to perceive a possibility that doesn't have a name yet? When the point from which you observe changes, the world doesn't always change immediately. But what the world can become through you does change. And then something happens that from the outside looks like magic. The conversations change. Opportunities appear. Coincidences increase. Life takes on a strange sense of responsiveness. Maybe reality didn't start obeying you. Maybe for the first time, you and it stopped speaking on different frequencies. If this idea changed the way you understand reality, write frequency in the comments and share what pattern you just recognized in your own life. Subscribe and turn on notifications to keep exploring the questions that Jacobo Grinberg left open about consciousness, perception, and that mystery we call reality.